Hey everyone, thank you so much for clicking on this video. The fact that you're willing to sacrifice a few minutes out of your day to watch my content really does mean the world to me. Guys, today we've got a very exciting video in store for you. I've had the awesome privilege to interview Andy Hale. For those of you that are unaware, Andy Hale is a civil rights attorney and producer. He has worked on two previous documentaries that were up on Netflix, A Murder in the Park and, of course, White Boy, which I'll be interviewing him about today. For those of you that are unaware, White Boy is a documentary about White Boy Rick, as he's more commonly known as, or Rick Wershe Jr. He was a drug dealer that was arrested at a very young age and kept in prison for an unreasonable amount of time. In fact, it's almost criminal. In fact, it is criminal how long he was kept in prison for. Andy Hale was an attorney on his case and in turn made a documentary about him, basically explaining all the negative things that went on in Rick's life. Guys, honestly, if you haven't watched the documentary yet, I would highly recommend it. The documentary was, of course, followed by a feature-length film starring Matthew McConaughey called White Boy Rick. This case has had a lot of media attention on it. So guys, thank you so much for clicking on this video. I am so excited to interview Andy Hale, and that's going to start right now. I've been joined by Andy Hale, who is a civil rights attorney that works on the case I mentioned before. And it's an absolute pleasure to have you on. Thank you so much for joining. Would you mind just telling the audience, my subscribers, just a little bit more about yourself so that we can get an understanding of you and your position?
Sure. So first of all, glad to be here. Thanks for having me on. My name is Andy Hale. I am a civil rights attorney based in Chicago. And I've also had this kind of crazy career path where the last several years I've been involved in producing some documentary movies about wrongful conviction cases.
So that's incredible. So you've actually been on more documentaries than just White Boy.
Yes, the first one we did was called A Murder in the Park, about the wrongful conviction of a guy named Al Story Simon. That appeared on Netflix. And then my partner who I did that with, Shawn Rech, who's based in Cleveland, he's the one that, we worked on the one for Rick Wershe Jr., which is White Boy. And then we've got a third one that's almost finished about a guy named Cleve Heidelberg, who I represented and was able to get his conviction vacated after 47 years in prison. And we got him out of prison. That one's going to hopefully come out by the end of the year. And that one is really powerful as well. So, and I have another one I'm working on. I can't say where it's going to be yet, but it should be out by the end of the year about another wrongful conviction case I'm working on. So some exciting stuff in the hopper, and fingers crossed to where all this goes.
That's actually an incredibly scary thought, though, is the amount of wrongful convictions that there are. Trusting the government, trusting the police force. It's scary how often they actually get it wrong, and they get it so wrong.
Well, what's scary is that you could get arrested right now. Somebody could come in right now to where you are, grab you, and somebody could pick you out of a lineup and say, yeah, that's the guy that robbed me or raped me or beat me. And if that person picks you out of a lineup, and they may really believe it was you, you may think that you can beat that case. But let me tell you something, my friend, it's very difficult once you've been charged with a crime to prove your innocence.
The idea of innocence until proven guilty. I've noticed a trend recently that we seem to jump to conclusions. We like to believe the victim, which I believe is a human emotion. When someone's suffering, we want to be there to help them. We want to be there to get justice. And ultimately, what do you think is the best way that we as public citizens can go about supporting the victim, but also maintaining the ideals that you are innocent until proven guilty?
I think we have to have an open mind to all the evidence. And I think a big difference now is what we know from studies, and the Innocence Project has talked about this. Witness misidentification is the leading cause of wrongful convictions. Somebody, a witness simply getting it wrong. And it may be the police did nothing wrong, law enforcement did nothing wrong. I worked on a case like this in Chicago, a case in the 1980s where a woman was raped. A guy got identified by some people as being the person who attacked her. 26 years later, after he spent 26 years in prison, DNA exonerated him, and the two witnesses simply got it wrong. So at least today, I think we know, and states attorneys and prosecutors know, that if all you have is a witness identification and nothing else, it's not a very strong case.
Yeah.
And you need more. And as long as jurors are open-minded to hearing all the evidence and don't jump to conclusions about simply a witness saying, what they think happened, that's a big step in the right direction.
So we're going to be talking about White Boy, which is ultimately about Richard Wershe Jr., who was convicted for drug smuggling or selling drugs. He was a drug dealer at 17 years old, and he was in prison for the longest time, and we believe wrongfully so. And so ultimately, there have been 2 motion picture films made about his case. The one is the documentary which we're talking about now, White Boy, and then also White Boy Rick, starring Matthew McConaughey. And so we're going to be talking about the documentary here, which Andrew Hale was also, as we mentioned earlier, a producer of. So that's incredibly awesome. And again, thank you so much for being here with me. I really appreciate it. And so I'm going to ask you my very first question quickly. And simply because my channel is ultimately about movies, about films, anything on Netflix, actually, let's talk about the documentary itself. Did you enjoy the documentary? As a viewer, when you sit down and watch the documentary, do you enjoy it?
Absolutely. I, for one, my favorite genre is documentary. I could watch a documentary about how to make peanut butter. I could watch a documentary about anything. I just find that to be really interesting. And I find it especially interesting in the true crime area. I love watching documentaries about real cases and real crimes. So yes, I thought White Boy was great. I really enjoyed it. And I think it told an incredible story that a lot of people didn't realize.
I can actually mirror what you said there. I knew of White Boy Rick, or Richard Wershe Jr., but I didn't actually understand that he was an FBI informant. And that is what the documentary brought forward to me. So of course, when I heard about this documentary, I was like, well, he's a drug dealer. How interesting can his story be? He was a drug dealer, and now he's in prison. But learning everything I learned through your documentary, it's incredibly powerful, incredibly moving. I was angry by the end of it. How can someone end up in prison for so freaking long?
Well, there's 2 parts of that I think really stood out to me. The first was, how is it possible that the FBI could recruit a 14-year-old boy to be an informant? And then the part that really blew me away was they flew him to Las Vegas when he was 15 years old and sent him to Las Vegas to get intel on some of the drug dealers. So let's just pause there. The fact that the FBI would use a 14-year-old in a very dangerous situation about drug dealing in Detroit was the first thing that blew me away. The second thing, and I think this is the biggest takeaway of all, is how did we even have a law on the books here where a 17-year-old for a non-violent drug offense could get life in prison without parole? Richard Wershe spent 32 years and 7 months in prison. Let's do an analogy. The Derek Chauvin verdict that just came down here in Minnesota. So he was found guilty in the death of George Floyd. I believe his maximum sentence will be 40 years. And I read something that said, with good time, he may serve 26 years something, okay? And that's for murder, okay? A 17-year-old for a nonviolent drug offense, there was a law in the books, he got life without parole. Yeah. Meaning, if he would have never gotten released, he could have spent 60 years in prison, 70 years in prison, and died in prison. So when you think about that law existed, it's really hard to imagine it.
Another thing that also really stood out to me in the documentary itself, there is a hitman, and he ultimately talks about how he admitted to killing 30 people, and he was only incarcerated for a fraction of the amount of time as Rick was.
I liked how that was filmed, where it was meant to give the viewer the reality that he was still in prison. He's wearing kind of a prison type shirt. There's a concrete wall behind him. And then one of my favorite parts of the film is when he takes off his shirt and you realize, wait a minute, this guy's not even in prison anymore.
Yeah. That was a very clever narrative device to show the reality of the situation. In my opinion, great cinema to bring reality into a situation where the audience can actually realize the weight of a scene they're witnessing.
The other thing to your point is, in terms of how many years Rick Wershe spent in prison, if you remember, Johnny Curry, who's in the film, was the big drug dealer in Detroit,
Yes.
one of the top ones. And he talked about how Rick was a low-level guy. And Johnny Curry served, what did he say? Was it 12 years? Yeah. I mean, like a third of what Rick spent, right? So you could just see the incredible injustice in the whole story.
Final question about the documentary before we actually move on to the case itself. That is, how accurate is this documentary? Myself, I've worked on several documentaries, and it's scary almost when I realized how one person can actually change the entire narrative of the documentary. And if you change the truth just a little bit, the entire narrative is different. So in your opinion, how accurate is this documentary? Can people treat it as gospel?
Well, I think it's very accurate in showing the corruption in Detroit, in the police department, and the corruption in the FBI. I think it's very factual in terms of, I mean, the length of Rick's sentence is undisputed. That law at the time, the 650 lifer law, you got life without parole. The part that I really want to make sure people understand is, A, Rick was not this drug kingpin. Yeah. He was a low-level guy. He was a 17-year-old kid. He was not some drug lord. And the other thing that I would want to emphasize is, Rick grew up in a poor part of Detroit, but he grew up with a normal family like most people. His dad was a very big entrepreneur, had a lot of patents. I don't want it to be portrayed like Rick grew up in this kind of, ragtag family. He actually had, a normal family like anybody else. They just happened to live in a poor part of Detroit. But in terms of the corruption and the story, I think it is very, very accurate.
And I think what you pointed out as well is a portion of what makes your documentary different to the Matthew McConaughey film is the Matthew McConaughey film definitely portrays that his family was a lot more of your stereotypical gangster upbringing. He was already exposed to that.
I take issue with that. Yeah. I think the theatrical film with Matthew McConaughey portrayed the family, I think in an unfair light. It was much more of a normal family growing up. Rick played Little League Baseball. He had a dad who loved him. His dad was an entrepreneur and a businessman. They didn't have a lot of money, but they were just like a normal family on the block. And Rick, because he got recruited by the FBI at the age of 14 to give information on the drug trade, when he got kicked to the curb when he was about 17, he reverted to basically the only life he knew the last few years, which was selling drugs, And so I think the documentary, really tried to tell that part of the story.
This is something that's always got to me about movies based on true stories in real life. And hopefully you can understand this as a movie maker yourself, as well as an attorney. The idea that someone can make a Hollywood movie about your life and actually completely change the public's perspective of you, completely change your legacy. I can just imagine getting caught up in a scandal one day, something out of my power. And I believe I'm quite a nice guy, but there could be a Hollywood documentary or a Hollywood film out there that paints me in a negative light. And that's actually how people are going to perceive me for the rest of my life, because they will know the movie version of me and not the true real life version of me. What's your opinion on that?
No, I think that is very true. And I agree 100%. You are at the mercy of a filmmaker I think a documentary film, it can have a point of view, but it should tell both sides of the story. And it's very easy to slant things, to misrepresent things. And, Rick can answer this more than me, but I think Rick had that issue with how White Boy Rick, the theatrical movie, presented him and his family, and could talk about that better than I could. And I think he felt like it wasn't a fair portrayal of him and his family and the way they were and the way they grew up. And you're absolutely right. You are helpless to control a narrative that potentially could be seen by millions of people.
There is a quote here. So we've mentioned how he was working with the FBI. There's a quote here that always breaks my heart. So I watched the documentary a few times, and this line always sticks out to me. I was led down this path by law enforcement. So please, can you just tell me, so that the viewers that haven't watched the documentary understand, how did he actually end up with the FBI? And how did they decide it was going to be a good idea to send this 14-year-old out into the fold with these incredibly dangerous people? Because that idea is still, to this day, after watching this documentary many times, after watching the film many times, I don't understand how grown adults, experts in their field, these are FBI agents, how do they think it's a good idea to send a kid, to send a child, basically a young teenager, out into this incredibly corrupt, scary world?
It's incredible to think that happened. And Rick's lucky to be here today, because if you remember in the movie, he gets shot.
Yeah.
And if that sister doesn't walk in at that moment and call an ambulance, this has a different story. And then the FBI, in my opinion, would have blood on its hands for what happened. You know, it started when the FBI was talking to Rick's father, and one of the FBI agents talks about this, and Rick Jr. seemed to be the one kind of giving his dad the answers to the questions about who these various people were in the neighborhood. Now, let's pause there. That's fine, but to then take it to this 10 levels higher and use Rick as an informant, put him on the street, put him out there mixing with these people, fly him to Las Vegas, put him in harm's way. Yeah, I don't know how they could have thought that was a good idea or proper procedure for the FBI at the time.
I've got a younger brother who's 21 now. And I'm picturing myself when he was younger. I was 16, he was 14. My brother at that age being exposed to that lifestyle blows my mind.
Well, the other thing is, it all depends on where you grow up, right? Because it's easy for somebody to judge who is comfortable and has money and lives in a comfortable neighborhood with family that can support him. Put yourself in a situation where the family doesn't have much money. Yeah. Now you've got money in your pocket because you're an informant. It's a whole different environment. It's the same thing with people who become drug dealers. A lot of them, they don't have the same opportunities perhaps that you and I do. I didn't grow up in that environment. I didn't have to kind of figure out how I was going to survive. But it goes back to putting somebody, a kid in a situation that was so dangerous. It's stunning, you know, and that's what I love about documentaries that are done well. They can tell a story about a case that people don't know all the details, you know. You can educate, enlighten, and tell a story in a powerful way.
And that was
you're 23, okay? Yeah. So you got arrested at 17 for a drug offense. You've been in prison 6 years. Oh, don't worry. You only got, 26 more years to go. Best of luck to you. I'll see you in 26 years.
So talking about prison, his entire trial was ultimately, he seemed like he was pushed against the wall. Everyone that he was supposed to trust seemed to be gunning for him. The media was portraying him in a bad light. His friends who were supposed to be there to protect him were portraying him in a bad light. Ultimately, he was being gunned down in a metaphorical sense. Can you please explain to everyone that hasn't watched the documentary exactly what went down during this period?
I think the biggest injustice of that the documentary tried to show was, if you recall, the lawyers got switched. He had a lawyer, and then all of a sudden, that lawyer goes by the wayside. A couple new lawyers come in who are kind of connected to the city of Detroit, and those lawyers do something that is simply unexplainable. They withdraw a motion to suppress evidence that had been filed, and that's never litigated in terms of how the evidence was found and used against him. And when you look at how the lawyers switched and the legal strategy decisions they made that, in my opinion, make no sense. Yeah. It was a rigged game for him.
Yeah. The lawyers also, they made the conscious decision to never mention that he was an FBI informant. That's correct, right?
Yes.
So they actively neglected the fact that he was put into this lifestyle or encouraged into this lifestyle by the FBI. Again, going back to his quote, he was led down this path by law enforcement. So That was never mentioned in his court cases. So of course the jury don't know the full story.
Right. And I think the biggest thing is the motion to suppress the evidence because, the way Rick was arrested, what did the police know? Where were the drugs? Were they on him? All those things. That's your best defense. That was his defense. And to have a motion to suppress withdrawn by your lawyers doesn't make any sense at all.
And then also the media, I felt, which has definitely become a topic of discussion on social media nowadays, is how can we actually know we can trust the media? And I think this case is also a really good illustration of that. We have Rick, this 17-year-old kid, who's ultimately portrayed as a drug kingpin, but that was never what he was. As we mentioned earlier, he was the smallest guy there in the game, but he was painted as someone that had a crew, and the media put this massive spotlight on him that he didn't actually deserve. So in your opinion, do you believe that media and the way the newspapers covered these articles and stuff like that, do you think that had any sway on the public perception of Rick and ultimately what the jury found whether he was innocent or guilty?
I do. I think his portrayal by the media as this drug kingpin, at the time, with having a law on the books that you got life for this 650 grams, this Michigan 650 lifer law, it was portrayed that, oh, he's this big drug kingpin, and this is why we have this law on the books. If it really would have been portrayed fairly, it's like, wait a minute, we got a 17-year-old kid who got into drug dealing because he was a FBI informant that was kicked to the curb. He's a low-level guy. He's not a big drug kingpin. Detroit has numerous people, many, many people much bigger than him. Are we really going to lock him up for the rest of his life without parole? And so it wasn't portrayed that way.
Yeah. And once again, I think that feeds into our earlier discussion of the media. We spoke about how someone can make a movie based on someone's life and it changes the public perspective of you. Again, that's exactly what happened here with the media. A story that wasn't accurate was spread around and it ultimately changed his legacy.
Right. That's the power, documentary filmmaking, any kind of filmmaking is a very powerful tool. And you just have to hope people tell a fair story because it does have the potential to mislead, for sure.
And so we've spoken a lot about the duration at which Rick Wershe stayed in prison. One thing I found incredibly interesting, again, because of your documentary, was the fact that in Michigan, you're allowed a parole hearing every 5 years. But he only had one successful parole hearing, which was in 2003, correct?
Well, so what happened was he was convicted in 1988. I think it was around 1999 that law was deemed unconstitutional. So he got a parole hearing, his first one in 1999. It was denied. 2003, denied. 2008, denied. 2013, denied. And then finally, in 2017, he finally got parole. But I think if you were to talk to Rick, another one of the injustices was there were people getting released from prison who got convicted under that law after it was deemed unconstitutional, but not him. Not him. It was deemed unconstitutional in 1999. He'd already served over a decade, and he had to serve another almost 2 decades until he got parole. So let's talk about the injustice of that as well.
So then finally, nearing the end now, Rick is free. And the documentary which was released in 2017, if I'm not mistaken, and the film and the Matthew McConaughey film was released in 2018. At that point, he was still in prison or incarcerated in Florida under GTA. Is that correct?
So what happened was Rick received parole from the state of Michigan, but he had a prior sentence that he got from time he was serving in Florida prison. And that was running consecutively, meaning Rick had to serve that after his Michigan sentence. You would have thought it would have run concurrently at the same time. So when he got released from Michigan in 2017, he then had to go to Florida and serve another 3 years in Florida for a little thing. There was a little car ring theft being run out of prison. Rick was like the lowest guy in the totem pole for that. He got He had to serve 3 years in Florida for it. Other people much more involved basically got a slap on the wrist. So just to add to another injustice for him, once he gets released in Michigan, he's got to go to Florida and serve 3 more years, which he finally did. And then he got released from Florida in 2020 and finally got out.
I don't want to make this joke, but he got out in 2020, which is, of course, when we had this whole coronavirus outbreak. And so ultimately, the freedom he's experiencing is obviously not the freedom he was hoping for. But ultimately, he's free now. He's out of prison.
So he's free now. He's back in the Detroit area where he grew up. He is enjoying every day, one day at a time, putting his life back together. Luckily, he's got a good support network, people that are around him, family and friends. And luckily for Rick, because he's just the kind of guy that has got such a strong will, such a hard work ethic, such mental toughness. If you met him right now and just talked with him for 20 minutes, you would never think this is somebody that spent almost 33 years in prison at all. You would think, oh, this is just some guy who's an entrepreneur, and he's got such a big heart. He is helping people in Detroit. He's involved in a company called Team Wellness that's helping people with mental health issues, drug abuse issues. He's helping with food drives on the weekends. I mean, this is a guy with the biggest heart of anybody I've met. And he has wasted no time in getting to work to basically give back to that neighborhood that he grew up in.
That's actually such an incredible story. That's a story of someone truly overcoming the odds and writing their own destiny, I believe.
You know, I was so impressed with Rick that I hired him. He works for me. He works for my law firm. He's kind of a jack of all trades. He says, "What's my title?" I'm like, "Well, you're paralegal / legal assistant / community relations director / marketing director," because I've got several cases now where I'm trying to help people in prison who are either, I believe, wrongfully convicted or the victims of abuse by prison guards. And he is a great resource to talk to people, to meet with people. He's been an incredible help, and he's got such a bright future. I joke, I'm going to be working for him one day is what I think. And here's the thing. I talked about Cleve Heidelberg, who I got out of prison after 47 years. 47 years. He got out in his mid-70s. He died in his sleep 10 months later. I have another client now. This is the documentary that's coming out later this year. He served 60 years in prison. He's now 82. So luckily for Rick, he's young enough to still have a good part of his life left. And Rick has no rearview mirror. Rick is looking out the windshield. Rick is driving forward. The past is the past. There's no time to waste. So he has not wasted any time starting the new chapter of his life.
Well, honestly, Andrew, thank you so much for your time. I really do appreciate it. And I'm pretty sure my viewers, my subscribers do too. We are really excited about your future projects. If you just want to remind us about all of that, and then also tell us, how can we support you and your future projects moving forward?
Well, first of all, I want to say thank you for watching the White Boy documentary. Thank you for talking about it, because it really is an incredible story that I think the documentaries I'm involved in, our goal is to shine a light on an injustice. So I think we accomplished that, and thank you for bringing attention to the case. There's another one. Check out my prior documentary called A Murder in the Park. It appeared on Netflix. You can download it on Amazon. It's about Al Story Simon. And then we got 2 coming out later this year. One about a guy named Cleve Heidelberg and one about a guy named Chester Weger. The best place to get updates is my website, halemonico.com, HALEMONICO. There's a media page there where we've got links to some of the media projects. And you can also follow me on Twitter, Andy M. Hale, ESQ, Esquire, where I tweet about some of the media projects and our updates. There's some interesting stories still to be told, and I'm looking forward to telling them.
Well, Andrew, thank you so much for joining me today. I will link everything you've mentioned down in the description below. So guys, if you are curious about following up with anything Andrew's let you know about, go down to the description, click down below, you'll see it all there. Andrew, thank you so much for joining me. I really do appreciate it.
My pleasure. Great to be here, and congratulations to the success with everything you've been doing.